a calm black man, was removed from first class. No yelling, no scene. He simply made one call, pulling $4.5 billion, locking the airline out of his own tech, and collapsing their empire. Who was he? The man they rejected years ago. This time he didn't shout. He rewrote the sky. The intercom crackled to the concourse of Gate 8 at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago, echoing across the high glass ceiling and cold metal walls. EtherJet Flight 3379 to San Francisco is now boarding. Priority for business class and elite members. Julian Cross rose from the metal bench, a weather-brown leather bag slung over his shoulder. He wore black jeans, a simple gray button-down shirt, and on his wrist, a vintage IWC watch, 1965 edition, a gift from his late mother. No one in the crowd knew that this calm, composed black man was the mind behind Crosspoint Holdings, the tech conglomerate that powered over half of the U.S. aviation infrastructure. To them, he was just another black man boarding business class. He paused to help an elderly woman with silver hair dislodge her stuck suitcase from the carpet's edge, offering her a quiet smile as she thanked him. Then, he continued toward the boarding gate. The flight attendant, her name tag reading Mara, greeted him with a professional smile. But when she glanced at his ticket, that smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. "Mr. Cross, welcome aboard," she said, though her tone lacked the usual warmth reserved for first-class passengers. Julian gave a slight nod, unfazed. He made his way to seat 3A, sat down, and casually checked his phone, like any other busy traveler. But within minutes, things took a turn. "Excuse me, sir," Mara returned, her gaze now more scrutinizing. "I need to verify your ticket again." Julian handed her the boarding pass and his ID. She studied them far longer than necessary, then gave a stiff nod. Everything seems fine. Yet her eyes still held that quiet suspicion. He glanced at the couple settling into seats 3B and 3C. The blonde woman with a pearl necklace clutched her purse tighter in her lap. The man beside her lifted his chin in a cold, wordless dismissal. "He doesn't look like he belongs in first class." Julian caught the faint whisper. Just moments later, Mara came back, this time flanked by two uniformed airport security officers. "Mr. Cross," the taller one said, "we've been informed of non-compliant behavior. We'll need you to deplane." "On what grounds?" Julian asked calmly, though his gaze had sharpened. "Report from the flight crew. We're asking for your cooperation to avoid disrupting the flight." The business class cabin fell silent. A young woman with braided hair in a row behind him raised her phone, quietly recording. Julian stood, adjusted his collar. No one saw the fist clench inside his coat pocket. He didn't resist. He didn't shout. He simply walked off the aircraft, back straight, eyes steady. The cabin door closed behind him. And that's when the storm began. Julian Cross walked slowly down the concourse of Gate 8, the soft knock of his brown leather shoes echoing on the polished tile floor. Behind him, the automatic doors of EtherJet Flight 3379 sealed shut, along with the curious stares, whispered remarks, and phone cameras still tracking his silhouette. No one followed him. No one apologized. He made his way to a quiet corner of the departure hall, where warm yellow light spilled diagonally through floor-to-ceiling windows. Julian pulled his phone from his coat pocket, opened his contact list, and tapped a name that didn't appear on screen. "It's me," he said. His voice wasn't loud or harsh, but it carried the weight of an irreversible decision. Pull all investment from EtherJet today. On the other end, a stunned female voice responded. "All of it? The entire $4.5 billion. "Not a cent left behind," Julian replied. "And notify legal. Revoke all access to Syncor tech system within the compliance window." Then he ended the call, without hesitation. Syncor Tech, the integrated data and operations platform EtherJet relied on for everything: booking, flight control, technical maintenance, route analytics, risk management. Every critical process ran on proprietary tech, owned by Julian Cross. Less than 2 hours later, baggage check systems at O'Hare International began to glitch. Dozens of bookings on the EtherJet website failed to process. The airline's mobile app froze completely. Flights were delayed, then canceled. Some aircraft, mid-route, had to switch to manual navigation after automated itinerary updates failed. Inside Ejects Operations Center, red warning lights blinked furiously across the monitoring wall. Software engineers scrambled to troubleshoot, but couldn't access Cortec's core system. The connection was dead. Root access had been fully revoked. We're locked out of our own system, one technician stammered. All routing is defaulting to emergency protocols. Meanwhile, at Ejects corporate headquarters, CEO Richard Halden was sipping espresso when his assistant burst into the room, face pale. "Mr. Halden, you need to see this." On the iPad screen, a video was going viral. A black man in a gray shirt being escorted off a business-class cabin by airport security, calmly, politely, but undeniably humiliated. Richard squinted. "Who is he?" The assistant zoomed in on the passenger manifest. Julian Cross. Victor's lips pressed into a hard line, his complexion shifting from irritation to pale dread. This can't be real. It couldn't be. And yet it was. Ejects had just thrown its biggest investor, the man who held the keys to its most vital tech infrastructure, off a plane in front of the entire world. And Julian Cross, still standing in a quiet corner of the airport, stared out across the runway. The sun was setting beyond the horizon, casting golden light across the glass in streaks of fire. He slid his phone back into his pocket. To them, he had been just another anonymous passenger. But from this moment on, they would never forget his name. Julian Cross stood by the expansive window of the highest conference room at Crosspoint Holdings headquarters, 49 floors above the endless stream of traffic crawling through Illinois below. In his hand was a faded printout, a rejection letter, edges yellowed by time, but the ink still cruelly clear. "Thank you for your interest in Ejects. After careful review of your application, we believe you are not a good fit for our company culture. We wish you all the best in your future endeavors." Beneath that politely brutal sentence, a scrawled signature in indifferent ink. Richard Halden. Julian let out a short laugh, dry, bitter. There was nothing amusing in it. He had just graduated from MIT that year, nearly top of his class, a rising star in automated aviation systems. But Ejects, the very company his mother once dreamed he would work for, hadn't just rejected him. They had marked his file as not a cultural fit, a polite way of saying a black man doesn't belong in a white-collar seat. Next to his desk sat a small photo in a plain wooden frame. In the picture, a young Julian sat at a piano while his mother, Celeste Cross, stood behind her with her hands gently resting on his shoulders. Her eyes were warm, full of hope and fire. "Never bow your head for being different, baby," she once told him on a rainy night. "Lift it higher, especially when they try to push you down. That's how you draw a new line with your own footsteps." Celeste Cross had never been wealthy. She was a mid-level administrator at a community hospital in Cleveland, Ohio, where Julian grew up in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment. She used to walk 3 city blocks instead of driving just to save on gas money, tucking away every dollar so Julian could chase his dream in tech. She passed from cancer when Julian was 27, just as Crosspoint signed its first contract with Skybridge, the 3rd largest airline in the U.S. Julian had stood at her grave and made a promise. "I'll never let them hurt someone like you again." And from that moment on, destiny began to reshuffle the board. 1 year later, Ejects plunged into a deepening crisis with its digital infrastructure. Their flight coordination systems were outdated, and the aircraft maintenance software no longer met new international standards. The board needed a breakthrough, fast and secure. And in every proposed solution draft, one name kept resurfacing. Cortec, developed by Crosspoint, under the guise of an anonymous investment fund named Crosspoint Holdings, Julian quietly approached. The contract was signed after just 3 rounds of negotiations. No one on Ejects' board realized that the man behind the very software now saving their operations was the same applicant they once dismissed for being culturally unfit. Julian chose anonymity not out of fear, but because he wanted his value to speak through his work, not pity. He wanted his technology to force them to bow, without ever knowing who stood behind it. And when they soared to new heights with Cortec, when every flight route relied on algorithms coded by his hands. That was when they dragged him from his first-class seat, like he was nothing. The game ended exactly where it began. But this time, he held the board. The chain of memories snapped back into place as Devin Rhee, his longtime college friend and senior executive assistant, stepped into the room with a tablet in hand. "Julian," Devin said in a quiet tone, placing the device gently on the table. "You need to see this." The screen displayed real-time market data. EtherJet was in freefall. The coordination network was overloaded. The booking interface had crashed. The mobile app had just been removed from the App Store due to security flaws. Over 28% of company shares were dumped in under 6 hours. Julian nodded, utterly unsurprised. From the drawer, he pulled out a small USB, latching it to a worn leather cord on his wrist. Etched into metallic face was a single Italian word: respiro, breath. "Begin phase 2, Julian said, eyes locked on the glass window overlooking the skyline. Devin nodded. "It's time." Somewhere out there, the world still believed Julian Cross was just a black man removed from a plane. But now, every step he took was shifting the sky they thought untouchable. Returning from a closed-door shareholders meeting, Julian stood still in his 49th-floor office at Cross Point Tower in Midtown Chicago. The glow of the financial news reflected on the glass wall, casting light across the screen, showing EtherJet's plummeting stock. But this was only the prelude. Julian turned to Devin. "It's time to use the second weapon." Devin didn't ask questions. He simply tapped a name on his phone. And less than 12 hours later, Tiana Brooks walked into the top-floor conference room, carrying a silver USB in the palm of her hand. Tiana, 34, had once served as the head of internal compliance at EtherJet. 3 years ago, she submitted a confidential report to the executive board, warning about an internal passenger scoring system, a social risk algorithm that routinely flagged black passengers and travelers from low-income zip codes for extra screening, seat reassignment, or denied boarding. In response, EtherJet quietly reassigned her to a warehouse supervisor role, a silent punishment. 6 months later, she resigned and vanished from the aviation radar. Julian found her first, not to use her, but to give her voice back. "I'm not here for revenge," Tiana said when he proposed they work together, "but I won't let them bury another person." Meanwhile, at a small cafe in Brooklyn, Derek Shaw, 39, a veteran investigative reporter with Liberty Ledger, was flipping through the documents Tiana had just sent. He had followed EtherJet's operations for nearly a decade, but had never obtained concrete proof. Now, the USB she handed over was a golden key. "I need access to Crosspoint's data suite," Derek said. "Your AI software can map discriminatory behavior through routing models, right?" Julian nodded. "You have 48 hours. I'll have the engineers open temporary access. They don't know their system's about to collapse." 2 days later, Liberty Ledger launched its exclusive expose titled Class B Passengers, The Hidden Discrimination Above the Clouds. Leaked documents, internal emails, staff training recordings, scoring templates that flag passengers for things like ethnically suggestive names, residential zip code, and non-traditional hair or dress styles. In one damning video, an EtherJet training executive flatly told a room full of employees, "First-class passengers should make others feel visually uncomfortable." Social media exploded. Hashtags like hashtag EtherJet bias and hashtag SeatWhileBlack dominated every platform within 6 hours. Major news outlets, from CNN to Vox, began labeling EtherJet as a new face of modern discrimination in the skies. Inside a darkened office at EtherJet HQ, CEO Richard Halden slammed his fist on the table, his voice trembling. "We're not just facing a financial crisis. We're staring down a reckoning of our brand identity for the entire industry." What he didn't know was, for Julian Cross, the real battle hadn't even begun. This was just a wake-up call. Less than 48 hours after Liberty Ledger's investigation lit up the country, the executive suite at EtherJet's Chicago headquarters turned into a war zone. In the boardroom on the 38th floor, CEO Richard Halden sat motionless, eyes glued to a stock ticker plummeting off a digital cliff. From $78 a share down to just under $43 within 3 trading days. Beads of sweat broke along his temples. Despite the thermostat holding firm at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, we need a strong statement. Deny everything, Halden said, his voice dry. Across from him sat Vanessa Cole, Chief Communications Officer, known to the public for her crisp white blazers, soothing voice, and razor-sharp media acumen. But today, her usual composure was gone. "We've been using denial for the past 10 years, Richard," she said coldly. "No one buys it anymore. The press isn't stupid. The shareholders aren't blind. And the consumers? They don't stay silent like they used to." Another voice chimed in. Elliot Whitford, vice chairman of the board, nursing a glass of whiskey, a man with a polished, aristocratic facade, known internally as little more than a self-serving heir. Sitting beside him was his wife, Marla Whitford, board member and the founder's daughter, famous for her deep ties to political lobbying circles. "That man, Julian Cross, should never have been allowed on our aircraft," Marla snapped. "Because of your weakness, we've lost nearly half our market value." Halden leaned forward, hands pressed against the table. "What exactly are you implying?" "I'm saying," Marla enunciated every word, "it's time this company is run by people who understand strategy, not people hiding behind camera crews." A deadly silence fell over the room, until Vanessa let out a cold, clipped laugh. "And what's your strategy? Plant lies on the internet? Take friendly reporters out to lunch to spin a new narrative? That tactic just makes everything reek even faster." Elliot slammed his palm on the table. "Enough. Pointing fingers won't save this airline. What we need is someone to take responsibility, and I won't sugarcoat it. Richard, it's time you step down." Halden's face went pale. The veins in his neck tightened. "I've led this company for 14 years, through 3 restructurings. You think I'm the problem?" Vanessa stood, casting her eyes across the room. "This isn't about Julian Cross anymore. This isn't some passenger incident. This is a result of a toxic culture that's been festering for decades, and now it's exploding because someone finally pushed back." Meanwhile, in another wing of the building, inside the HR department, old complaint files, once buried and forgotten, were being unearthed by legal aides. A wave of internal whistleblowing was beginning to swell. A former employee posted on social media, "I was reassigned for reporting discriminatory conduct. Now I realize I wasn't an isolated case. We were all Julian Cross. We just didn't have someone recording it." Back on the top floor, Halden sat alone after the meeting had dissolved. His coffee had gone cold. On the muted TV screen, the breaking news ticker rolled across. EtherJet stock drops another 12%. International partners sever ties. SEC launches federal investigation. He leaned back, eyes closed, and he knew the storm hadn't yet reached the eye, but it was coming. Fast. In stark contrast to the chaos unraveling inside EtherJet's headquarters, Julian and his team were busy building something new. At a once-abandoned terminal repurposed into a sleek operations hub on the outskirts of Chicago, morning sunlight streamed through soaring windows, illuminating a newly unveiled logo, Sol Airlines. Clad in a charcoal gray suit, Julian Cross stepped up to the podium with his signature calm. After years in shadows, he now stood at the center of a media firestorm, not to exact revenge, but to rewrite the standards of an entire industry. "We're not just launching an airline," Julian said firmly, his deep voice echoing to the packed auditorium. "We're creating a space where every passenger, regardless of skin color, status, or background, is treated with equal dignity." Behind him, a large screen cycled through visuals of a diverse flight crew, a transparent training pipeline, the all-new Syncortec 2.0 system, now fully under Julian's control, and a set of equity-first human resource policies. Beside him stood Tiana Brooks, now Chief Human Rights Officer of Sol Airlines, nodding with pride. In the audience, Derek Shaw, recorder in hand, prepped for his exclusive interview. Everything seemed flawless, until a man in his 50s suddenly stood up in the crowd. "You're a traitor," he shouted, waving a sheet of paper. "You invested in EtherJet. You stayed silent for 5 years." The room fell into stunned silence. Julian turned his gaze directly to the man, a former maintenance worker who had been fired without cause. I was silent, Julian said calmly, because I believed the system could correct itself. But when they pulled me off that plane in front of hundreds, because of the color of my skin, I realized change doesn't come unless someone is willing to act. The man sat down. The entire room rose in a standing ovation. In the days that followed, the Sol Airlines effect swept across the country like wildfire. Major media outlets like The Atlantic and CNN ran headlines. A flight toward fairness. Sol Airlines opens a new chapter in American aviation. Ejects stock dropped another 18% within the week. Thousands of flight cancellations followed, along with widespread boycotts from the Black, Latinx, and LGBTQ+ communities. A video quickly went viral. A 7-year-old African-American girl at a Sol Airlines check-in counter turned to her mother and whispered, "Mom, the pilot looks just like Uncle Jerome at home." Watching the clip from his office, Julian's eyes shimmered. "Mom," he whispered, "I've redrawn the sky just like you taught me." The news of Julian Cross founding Sol Airlines swept through the aviation world like a tsunami. Ejects stock plummeted another 22% in just 48 hours. But instead of adjusting their strategy or owning their mistakes, Ejects leadership made the oldest and most dangerous move in the book, Personal Attack. At an emergency press conference, PR director Vanessa Cole appeared on screen with the Eject logo behind her, her face tight with powder and pressure. "We have reason to believe that Mr. Julian Cross, the man behind Sol Airlines, is threatening national aviation safety by withdrawing core technology in a personal vendetta," she declared, her tone sharp, but her eyes unable to meet the camera. Soon after, a smear campaign exploded across conservative news outlets. Sensational headlines dominated front pages. "Billionaire's revenge. Are passengers safe under Sol Airlines wings?" "Julian Cross. Tech genius or enemy of the skies?" But in an age of data and transparency, lies don't last long. Julian didn't respond immediately. Instead, he appeared 3 days later in an exclusive live interview on GNN, hosted by investigative journalist Derek Shaw. Facing the camera, Julian wore his signature pale gray shirt and vintage wristwatch. His calm presence was almost unnerving. "I'm being accused of compromising flight safety?" Julian chuckled softly. "Here is the actual Syncortex system log from that day. Systems were running normally. As for the EtherJet 3379 incident to San Francisco, it had nothing to do with technology. It was pilot error, acknowledged in the airline's own internal report." He presented an independent audit by the National Aviation Safety Review Board, confirming that Sol Airlines tech, including altitude control, air traffic AI coordination, and collision prevention, was the most advanced and precise system currently in use, exceeding FAA standards. But the real counterstrike came when Derek played never-before-seen footage, a closed-door meeting at Eject headquarters, where CEO Richard Halden was caught instructing Vanessa Cole to do whatever it takes to make Cross look like a public threat, even if it means bending the truth. The nation was stunned. Within hours, hashtags like #JusticeForJulian and #ShameOnEtherJet flooded social media. Communications experts labeled it a corporate self-immolation. Julian didn't need to shout. He only needed the truth and a camera, and this time, no one could silence the fire he had lit. The morning of Sol Airlines' inaugural flight, the skies over Chicago were cloudless. On the runway of a newly constructed terminal, the aircraft sat in quiet readiness, bearing the golden sun emblem on a pristine white fuselage, a symbol of a new era. The media swarmed. Hundreds of passengers had booked within hours of ticket release. In the cockpit sat a Vietnamese-American female captain, and beside her, a black first officer once denied promotion at Eject for not fitting professional image. Julian Cross didn't give a long speech. He simply stepped to the podium, nodded to the crowd, and said, "We didn't build this airline in reaction. We built Sol Airlines for those who once had no seat, and now they do." The room rose in a standing ovation. As Sol Flight 001 lifted off the runway to a wave of applause from passengers and press, Julian stood quietly behind the glass of the operations tower. In his eyes was something more than victory, a deep peace. At that same moment, just a few miles away, the FBI raided Ejects' executive floor, slapping handcuffs on Richard Halden in front of the board. The charges: embezzlement through shell companies, falsified audit reports, covert funding of anti-diversity lobbying groups. Richard said nothing except, "Call my lawyer." Marla Whitford, exposed for past discriminatory remarks and for funneling money to extremist groups through her family foundation, was forced to resign from the board. Her husband, Elliot, quietly retired to avoid formal investigation. Meanwhile, on the 30th floor, Vanessa Cole and Graham Ellis, the last two survivors in Ejects' executive ranks, were scrambling to salvage what was left. "We need to launch a diversity initiative. Immediately, hire a black spokesperson. Partner with a few figures who experienced discrimination in the industry," Vanessa rattled off during an emergency meeting. "Like who?" Graham asked, overwhelmed. "Like Tiana Brooks," she said flatly. "She's consulting for Sol Airlines. We invite her, or at least pretend to." Graham let out a dry chuckle. "I thought we'd hit rock bottom. But clearly there's still room to dig." Just outside the Ejects building, CNN broadcasted the first Sol Airlines flight on a giant public screen. A group of employees stood watching in silence. One voice whispered, "That should have been us. But we missed it." Julian wasn't gloating. He didn't need to. Back in his office, a message came in from the mother of a young black boy, accompanied by a photo. The child stood in front of a Sol Airlines jet, grinning ear to ear. "Thank you for creating a world where my son can dream of flying without fearing he'll be dragged down." Julian smiled. The fight wasn't over. But in that moment, he knew he was flying in the right direction. 2 months after Sol Airlines' inaugural flight, Julian Cross visited a public high school on the outskirts of Montgomery, Chicago, the very school where his mother began her teaching career before being forced to resign for speaking out against injustice. There were no bodyguards, no cameras trailing, just a man in a simple button-down shirt, stepping into a classroom with open hands and honest eyes. "We're often taught that change comes from those in power," Julian said, his voice quiet but firm. "But the truth is, change begins with the questions you dare to ask, and what you choose to do once you know the answer." Talks like this were no longer rare exceptions. Since the founding of Pathfinder Foundation, a youth initiative personally funded and mentored by Julian, hundreds of students in overlooked communities have received scholarships, career mentorship in aviation, tech, and business leadership. One flagship program, Future Flight Crew, gave teens who were once pushed to the margins a literal seat in the cockpit, training alongside professional pilots aboard real commercial flights. At Sol Airlines headquarters in Chicago, Julian also launched Syncor Next, a next-gen tech platform for public transportation and airport security, built on transparency, impartiality, and the protection of civil rights. Cities from Detroit to Oakland quickly signed on to pilot the system, inspired by Sol's example and its measurable success. It wasn't just aviation. Julian quietly invested in community projects, affordable housing, public electric transit systems, and youth skill-building centers. But for him, nothing mattered more than planting hope. "I don't need you to become me," he once said during an interview. "I just want you to believe in yourself enough that no one else gets to decide who you are." Julian's presence gradually became a living symbol for a new generation, a man who once got pulled out of his seat, only built an entire airline so others could have a seat of their own. He was invited to speak at TED Global, to meet the president at the White House, and was named among the top 100 most influential people of the year. And yet, every Saturday morning, if you visited a small park on the south side of Chicago, you could still find Julian teaching kids in the neighborhood how to ride bikes. Because to him, balance was always the first lesson in freedom. Sometimes, the biggest change begins with staying upright and not giving up. Flight 117 of Sol Airlines from Chicago to San Diego. A 7-year-old black girl sat by the window, eyes wide with wonder. Her name was Emma, wearing a pink jacket with fluffy white clouds and clutching a book titled Great Women Pilots in History. Each time the plane hit a small bump, Emma turned to her mother with a grin. "I'm not scared. I'm going to fly planes. I want to be a captain. A flight attendant crouched to her eye level and smiled. First time flying? Emma nodded, brimming with excitement. And not the last. I'm going to work for Sol Airlines, just like Uncle Julian. Her mother brushed her hair gently, her eyes beaming with pride. That Uncle Julian wasn't just a name. His face had become familiar in every children's book on modern justice, every feature on social impact entrepreneurship, and in the hearts of children who were now dreaming dreams that once were considered too bold, too far, too impossible. As the plane rose through layers of white clouds, in the business class cabin, a silver-haired man in a baseball cap sat quietly, watching the sunlight gleam off the wings. No one recognized him as Julian Cross. He smiled softly as he heard the girl behind him, Amira, say to her mom, "I'm going to join the Future Flyers program." Mom said it's Mr. Julian Scholarship. Julian turned back the window. The light glided gently across the clouds, soft as breath, as if the sky itself were whispering something only he could hear. A week later, Julian set foot in St. Louis, Senegal, the birthplace of his mother, Celeste Cross, who had immigrated to the U.S. at the age of 18. On the red dirt road leading to the Gondon shoreline, Julian stopped beside an ancient baobab tree, the same one his mother used to describe when he was little. "That place," she once told him, "is where you'll understand why we must rise." He sat beneath the ancient tree, fingertips brushing the earth as if reaching for something buried deep in his lineage. No stage lights, no interviews, no looming agendas. Just him, the ocean breeze, and the laughter of children kicking a ball in the distance. Julian pulled out an old piece of paper, a handwritten letter from his mother, penned the day he graduated from MIT. "Use your brilliance to serve justice. Remember, not every seat is built for you. Sometimes you must build your own chair and invite others to sit." Tears slipped quietly down his cheek, but his face was lit with peace. Because in the end, greatness isn't just about how high you can fly, but how many people you bring into the sky with you.